An elderly woman discovered a mysterious metal door hidden in an ancient oak. When she opened it and saw what was inside, her entire world changed forever. Stay until the end. This story will move your heart. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The morning felt colder than it should have, the kind of cold that didn't really come from the air, but from time, from the way quiet places start to feel heavier when you get older. Margaret Reed walked the narrow dirt path that cut through the woods behind Willow Creek, her cane tucked under her arm, and a small tan terrier trotting ahead of her. His name was Rusty. He was almost as old as she was, which is why she always told him, "We're both still walking, so we're both still winning." He usually wagged his tail when she said that. Not today. Today, Rusty was restless. He kept trotting ahead a few paces, stopping, circling back, then hurrying forward again. His ears twitched at sounds Margaret couldn't hear. His body was tense. "What's got you acting like you're on payroll?" she muttered softly. "You think you're law enforcement now?" There was no one else on the trail to hear her. There usually wasn't. Most folks in town didn't come this deep into these woods anymore. Teenagers did late at night to drink warm beer around a fire and scare each other with stories. But people Margaret's age? No, not for years. But Margaret had been walking this trail her whole life. She'd walked it as a girl with bare knees and scraped shins. She'd walked it with her husband, back before the cancer. She'd walked it with her son when he was young, back before he moved to Dallas and started saying, "Mom, you shouldn't be out there alone." And now she walked it alone anyway, with Rusty, which to her did not count as alone. Willow Creek wasn't much of a town, at least not anymore. The paper mill had closed in '97. The diner on Main Street changed owners 4 times and finally turned into a for lease sign and a dusty window. But the woods were still there. The woods didn't leave. The woods didn't forget you. And she didn't forget them. The trail curved between tall oaks and maples, the ground soft with last year's leaves. It had rained overnight, not hard, but enough to leave the forest floor damp and dark and smelling like earth. She loved that smell. Wet dirt, bark, slow rot. It smelled like something that had existed long before her and would exist long after her. There was comfort in that. Rusty suddenly stopped, not slowed. Stopped. His whole body went stiff, front paw lifted, nose pointed straight ahead. His ears were up, his breathing quick and sharp, and a low sound came out of him. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine, something in between. Margaret frowned. "What is it?" she asked, but her voice came out quieter than she meant it to. Rusty didn't look back at her. He didn't wag. He just stared. And then he pulled. Margaret tightened her fingers around the leash. "Hey, easy," she said. "You try to drag me and we're both going down, and then who's driving us to urgent care? You?" But Rusty wasn't listening. He tugged hard, harder than he had in years, making a desperate, impatient sound. Margaret let him lead. She shuffled forward, careful with her footing, feeling the soft earth shift under her sneakers. Her knee ached, but she kept going. "Where are you taking me, boy?" she breathed. They stepped off the main trail, just a few feet at first, then more. Branches brushed against her jacket, damp leaves whispering against her sleeves. Twigs cracked under her shoes. She knew this area. She knew every part of these woods. She had come out here for 50 years. That wasn't an exaggeration. That was her entire adult life. She could have walked it in her sleep. So why did this part feel wrong? Rusty stopped so fast she almost stumbled over him, They stood in front of a tree. Not just any tree. The oak. People in Willow Creek always talked about the old oak, and everyone meant a different tree. But for Margaret, it had always been this one. It was enormous. Older than the town itself, probably older than the country. Its trunk was so wide 3 people couldn't have wrapped their arms around it. The bark was thick and ridged and dark, and on rainy days it held the water in its grooves like veins. Rusty lowered himself, belly almost to the ground, nose pressed tight against the base of the trunk. He let out a quiet, trembling whine. Margaret felt something in her chest tighten. "Hey," she said softly, kneeling with effort. "What's the matter? You hurt?" Rusty wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the tree. No, not at the tree. At something on the tree. Margaret leaned in. At first, she thought she was seeing a patch of metal trash someone had wedged there. Maybe kids, maybe hunters. Sometimes people nailed things to trees. Trail signs, beer cans, knives. People could be stupid. But this wasn't that. It wasn't nailed on. It wasn't attached from the outside at all. It was set in. Her first clear thought was impossible. That's a door. Her breath caught. Right there, in the thick bark of the oak, barely visible beneath moss and dark sap, was a small rectangular metal door. It couldn't have been taller than her hand, maybe 6 or 7 inches high. It was old, really old. The surface was pitted and rough with rust, and what might once have been paint had long since peeled away. On one side, eaten with corrosion, was a hinge. On the other was a tiny padlock, the kind you'd find on an old lunchbox or toolbox. The whole thing looked like it had been there forever. No, that wasn't possible. Margaret's heart started to beat faster, and she didn't like that. She didn't like that at all. She didn't scare easy. She never had. She had raised a child through layoffs and medical bills. She had watched her husband fade in a hospital chair. She had driven herself to urgent care during an asthma attack because the ambulance took too damn long. She did not scare easy, but this was not normal. This was not there before. Her mind wanted to argue with that, and her memory answered. I've walked past this tree hundreds of times. I would have seen this. I would have noticed. Wouldn't I? Her hand lifted on its own. She reached out and touched the metal with her fingertips. It was cold. Colder than the morning air. Colder than it should have been. The moss around it was damp and soft, but the little door itself felt like something buried underground. Rusty whined again. "It's okay," she whispered, even though she didn't know if that was true. "It's okay, baby. I see it." The padlock was old. Old in a way that felt personal, not random. It wasn't the shiny kind from a hardware store. It was dull and corroded, the metal bubbled and dark orange, almost eaten through by time. Whatever was locked behind that little door had been locked a long time ago. Margaret swallowed. For a long moment, she just crouched there, breathing shallowly, staring at the thing without moving. Her first thought was, don't touch it. Her second thought was louder. I have to know. She tried logic. It's probably trash. Somebody probably did this as a joke. But she didn't believe that. Teenagers didn't drag around antique padlocks and weld doors into living trees. Teenagers spray-painted crude drawings and carved their initials and left beer cans. They didn't do this. Her knee began to burn from crouching. She exhaled and pushed herself slowly back to standing, bracing a hand against the tree for balance. The bark felt solid and damp under her palm. For just an instant, no more than a heartbeat, she felt something else under her hand, something like a hum. A low vibration. a quiet, steady pulse, like she was touching the throat of something alive. She pulled her hand back quickly. "Okay," she whispered to Rusty. "Okay, here's what we're gonna do." Rusty looked up at her, eyes wide. "We're gonna go home," she said. "We're gonna come back, and we're gonna open it." Her voice shook on that last part. She pretended not to hear it. Rusty's tail flicked once. Margaret took a step back, then another, leash firm in her grip. Leaves crunched softly under her shoes. She couldn't take her eyes off the tree, off that impossible little shape cut into living wood. She felt suddenly like she shouldn't turn her back on it. Like if she stopped looking, it would disappear. Or worse, that it wouldn't disappear. And she'd just have to live with the fact that the world wasn't what she thought it was. She finally forced herself to turn. "Come on," she said. They retraced their path through the brush, back toward the trail. Branches slid across her jacket. A drop of rainwater fell from a leaf and landed on the back of her neck, cold enough to make her flinch. She felt watched. That was ridiculous, she told herself. Absolutely ridiculous. She was 72 years old and sane. Still, the feeling didn't go away. When they reached the main trail, the woods felt different, quieter. The bird song had dimmed. The wind had gone still. Even the distant hum of traffic from the highway seemed to have faded. The air felt heavy, like before a storm, or like a secret was sitting there between the trees, listening. Margaret's mind moved fast in a way it hadn't in years. She made a list. She was good at lists. Lists were how she lived now. Bolt cutters, flashlight, gloves, and, this wasn't for the list, but she admitted it to herself anyway, her phone, just in case. She'd call it for pictures, but she knew the truth. She was old, yes. She was alone, yes. She was also not stupid. As she and Rusty made their way back toward the edge of the woods, the houses of Willow Creek slowly appeared through the thinning trees. Small houses, most with peeling paint. A lot of them with flags out front. Some American, some military, some that hadn't been taken down since the last election. Margaret's own house sat at the end of a cracked cul-de-sac, a squat single story with a wide porch and a garage that always smelled faintly of motor oil and old grass clippings. The roof needed work. The porch steps needed work. She needed work. But it was hers, and that was enough. She unlocked the front door, let Rusty inside, and headed straight for the garage. The garage was her place. Her husband had taught her that. Every woman should know her way around her own tools, he used to say, back when his hands were still strong and steady. And she had listened. Hammer, crowbar, socket set, vice grips, everything in its place, labeled in black marker. She wasn't fast anymore, but she was precise. She found the bolt cutters hanging on the pegboard. When she lifted them, the weight of them settled into her hands. Solid, familiar, comforting. Her heart pounded. She did not fully understand why her hands were shaking. She set the bolt cutters down just long enough to grab a small flashlight. The good one, the heavy one, the one her son kept telling her to keep by the bed in case of power outages, like Texas somehow didn't get those too. She stuffed the flashlight into her jacket pocket, picked up the bolt cutters again, and stood there for a moment, listening to her own breathing. "This is stupid," she told herself quietly. Then, almost in the same breath, "I'm going back." She clipped Rusty's leash again. The dog bounced at her feet, anxious, excited, uneasy. He knew they weren't done. He'd known before she did. They walked, past the last cracked driveway, past the for sale sign that had been sitting in Mrs. Hanley's front yard for 6 months with no bites. Past the faded community watch sign everyone pretended still meant something. Back under the tree line, back into the wet smell of the woods. By the time they reached the old oak again, the light had shifted. The sun had climbed, but under the trees it still felt dim. Shadows pooled at the base of trunks. The air felt cooler, thicker. Rusty slowed as they got close. He didn't bark this time. He didn't pull. He just stood, pressed against her leg, staring at the same spot. The door was still there. Margaret let out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Some part of her had been quietly afraid that it would be gone, that she had imagined it, that she had slipped finally into that place people whispered about when older folks forgot names, or left the stove on, or told a story twice in 1 hour. She hated the way people did that, the way they tilted their heads and softened their voices and said, "It's okay," like you were already halfway gone. No, it was there. She wasn't imagining anything. The small rectangle of rusted metal sat under the rough bark, almost swallowed by it. The tiny padlock hung from its latch like a tired eye. Margaret shifted the bolt cutters in her hand. Her heart picked up again. "This is breaking and entering," she whispered to herself and then snorted softly. Into a tree. Lord, have mercy. She positioned the jaws of the cutters around the corroded lock. Her hands were steady now. Her body remembered this kind of work. Pressure, angle, commit. She squeezed. The metal resisted. "Don't you start," she muttered through her teeth. She adjusted her grip, leaned in, and put her weight into it. The lock gave with a sudden sharp crack. The sound echoed through the trees, louder than it should have been, like a gunshot fired into the damp morning air. Rusty flinched. Margaret's pulse hammered in her throat. The broken lock dropped into her palm, flaky, orange, almost crumbling apart. She let it fall to the ground. For a long moment, she didn't move. The little door sat there in front of her, no longer held shut. All she had to do was open it. Her mouth felt dry. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, we're doing this." She reached out. Her fingertips brushed the cold metal. And slowly, feeling against all logic, like someone on the other side might hear, she began to pull the tiny door open. The hinge groaned. The sound that came out of that tree wasn't just a creak. It was old. It was deep. It sounded like something exhaling after holding its breath for too many years. A smell drifted out. Damp. Earthy. Sweet and sour at the same time. The smell of old wood, old cloth, old air that hadn't moved in a very, very long time. Rusty made a quiet sound in his throat. Margaret swallowed hard. She lifted her flashlight with her free hand, clicked it on, and leaned in to see what was waiting inside. She wasn't ready for what she was about to find. But it had been waiting for her anyway, and once she saw it, there would be no going back. The next morning, the woods looked different. The light was the same, soft, golden, filtering through the high branches, but the trees felt older, heavier, as though they had been whispering secrets through the night. Margaret Reed didn't sleep well. She'd sat up late, staring at her hands, remembering the sound of that lock snapping and the hollow creak of the tiny metal door. What she saw inside still haunted her, not because she understood it, but because she didn't. When she had leaned in with the flashlight, the hollow behind the door seemed deeper than it should have been. It wasn't just a crack or a hiding spot. It felt like a small chamber carved inside the oak itself. She remembered seeing cobwebs, dust, and something pale in the shadows, a shape that made her heart hammer until she'd stumbled backward, breathless. She'd slammed the door shut, trembling, and rushed home with Rusty dragging behind her. But the image wouldn't leave her. Now, standing on her porch with a cup of coffee, she couldn't stop glancing toward the line of trees. It was only a half-mile walk to that oak. She could make it there in 15 minutes, even with her bad knee. Every logical thought told her to leave it alone, to forget whatever she had seen. But curiosity had always been her flaw. "I'll just look again," she murmured to herself, just to be sure I wasn't imagining things. By the time she reached the tree line, the coffee was still warm in her stomach, and Rusty's leash was tight in her hand. The forest smelled of wet moss and pine. Everything was quiet except for the crunch of leaves beneath her sneakers. When she reached the massive oak, her breath hitched. The small door was still open. Margaret froze. She had closed it last night. She remembered it clearly. She had even brushed away the moss, pressed the metal shut, and heard the faint click of the hinge. But now it gaped open again, a black mouth in the bark. Rusty began to whine, pawing at the earth. "Stop that," she whispered, though her own voice shook. "It's just wind. Probably the hinge came loose." She knelt slowly, gripping the flashlight again. Her reflection trembled in the metal as she leaned closer. The smell coming from inside the hollow was strong now, earthy, like damp soil mixed with something older, something that didn't belong in the world anymore. She aimed the flashlight beam into the space. At first, all she saw was darkness. Then the light slid across something solid. A stone. No, shaped like a small headstone. Her pulse jumped. She wiped the dust with her gloved hand, and the beam revealed faint carvings. There were letters, but time had nearly erased them. The surface was chipped and moss-covered. Below the letters, her light caught on another shape, a little bear, not carved beside the stone, but part of it. A teddy bear-shaped tombstone. Her hand trembled as she brushed away more dust. Around the small stone lay remnants of objects, things that once had color but now were gray and crumbling. The outline of a toy car, the broken face of a porcelain doll, buttons maybe from a child's shirt, and ribbons tangled and brittle. Margaret's eyes burned. Her throat tightened. She dropped the flashlight and pressed her hand to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. The sound came out thin and small, like it didn't belong to her. She stayed there, kneeling in the damp earth, her heart thudding as she realized what she had found. This wasn't a random hiding place. This wasn't some old prank or secret storage. It was a grave. Her mind raced. Who would bury something inside a tree? Who would mark it like this? She looked around, scanning the woods as if the answer might step out of the fog. The silence pressed against her like weight. She felt a chill deep in her bones, a strange, respectful fear. For a moment, she thought about closing the door again, pretending she had never seen it. But something inside her refused. It wasn't just curiosity now. It was responsibility. Someone had loved the child whose toys lay here. Someone had carved that little bear-shaped stone with their hands and their tears. Margaret took off her hat and lowered her head. She didn't pray often, not since her husband died. But in that moment, she whispered something anyway. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb you." Rusty whined again, his small body pressed close to her knee. She reached down and stroked his fur, grounding herself. "It's okay, boy," she murmured. "We'll fix it. We'll make it right." She stood slowly, knees aching, and closed the tiny door with care. The metal scraped against the bark, and for a moment it sounded almost like a sigh. She picked up the broken lock from the ground, turning it over in her hand. It was useless now, eaten through by rust. When she got home, she went straight to the garage. She placed the old lock on her workbench and stared at it under the light. The air smelled of oil and wood dust. On the pegboard above her, tools hung in neat rows. Her husband's hammer, his screwdrivers, his favorite measuring tape, the one she still couldn't throw away. She reached for a small notepad and began to write. Oak tree, small metal door, memorial, ask town hall, records, maybe church cemetery logs. She tapped the pen against the page. Her hand was shaking. That night, the rain started again. Drops pattered against the windows like whispers. Margaret sat by the window with her old laptop, searching online archives for anything, missing children, drownings, old obituaries. Willow Creek didn't have much digital history, but she found a scanned newspaper from the 1950s. The headline was small, almost hidden at the bottom of the page. Local boy drowns in Willow Creek. Her stomach turned. She clicked it open. Thomas Larkin, age 5, drowned near Willow Creek on June 18, 1954. He was last seen playing near the water's edge. His parents, Samuel and Ann Larkin, were unable to afford a burial plot. Sources say they created a memorial near the boy's favorite tree. Margaret's breath hitched. His favorite tree. She leaned back in her chair, heart pounding. The oak. It had to be. She read the last line again. The memorial was said to be located deep within the forest in a hollow oak. The site was never formally recorded. Margaret sat there for a long time, listening to the rain. She realized what she had done. She had broken into someone's resting place, a child's. She hadn't meant to, but it didn't matter. She had disturbed something sacred. Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Thomas," she whispered. She wiped her cheeks, stood up, and went to the shelf by the back door. There, among the gardening supplies, was a small tin box filled with candles. She gathered a few, along with a lighter, and placed them in a paper bag. Then she went to her closet and found a new padlock she'd bought months ago for her shed. She tested it. It clicked perfectly. The rain eased into drizzle as she stepped outside. The street lamps glowed softly through the mist. Rusty barked once from the porch, but didn't follow. Maybe he knew this was something she had to do alone. By the time Margaret reached the oak, the forest was silent again. Her shoes sank into the damp soil. She knelt, heart heavy, and placed the candles in front of the little door. One by one she lit them, shielding the flames from the wind. The tiny lights flickered against the bark, warm and trembling. She placed the new lock on the door and clicked it shut. "Rest easy now," she whispered. "I'll keep it safe for you." Then she sat in the quiet, watching the candlelight dance. For the first time in years, she felt peace, deep, quiet, and real. And though she didn't hear it clearly, somewhere behind the whisper of the leaves, a faint sound drifted through the air. A soft giggle. The sound of a child, happy and free. The morning after Margaret sealed the door and placed the candles, the world outside seemed softer. The fog that blanketed Willow Creek hung low over the rooftops like breath held in suspense. Yet, despite the calm, Margaret woke up with a strange heaviness in her chest, a feeling somewhere between guilt and peace. She had done what she thought was right, but the memory of what she'd seen inside that tree refused to leave her mind. Rusty lay curled at the foot of her bed, snoring softly, oblivious to her unease. She stared at the ceiling for several minutes before finally sitting up. Her eyes drifted to the notepad on her bedside table, the one where she had written, "Thomas Larkin, age 5. Beneath that, she had added another note in shaky handwriting. Return today, bring flowers. The truth was, she hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the hollow of that oak, the tiny bear-shaped stone and the toys, silent and crumbling in the dark. There was something unbearably human about it all, something that demanded more than a lock and a candle. By noon, she was back in her car, driving slowly down the old road that curved toward the forest. The windshield wipers squeaked rhythmically, brushing away a light drizzle. She stopped at a small roadside florist, the only one left open in town, and bought a bouquet of white lilies. The woman at the counter, Mrs. Hanley, gave her a polite smile. "Grave visitin'?" she asked kindly, wrapping the stems in paper. Margaret hesitated. "Something like that," she murmured. She drove the rest of the way in silence. When she reached the trailhead, she parked under the same crooked sign that read Willow Creek Nature Path, established 1928. The forest loomed ahead, the trees tall and ancient, their tops lost in mist. Rusty whined softly from the passenger seat, tail low. He didn't like this place anymore. "It's all right, boy," she whispered, patting his head. "We'll be quick." She followed the narrow dirt path, her steps steady despite the mud. The air smelled of rain and wet earth. Every sound, a dripping leaf, a snapping twig, seemed magnified. When she reached the oak, the sight made her pause. The candles she'd lit the night before had melted into pale puddles of wax. The door was closed, the new lock glinting faintly in the weak daylight. Margaret knelt slowly, brushing away fallen leaves. The flowers she'd brought rested in her hand, their scent delicate, clean. "Hello again," she whispered, her voice catching. "I brought these for you." She placed the lilies at the base of the tree, arranging them neatly beside the candles. For a moment, she simply sat there, listening to the stillness. The forest was quiet, almost reverent. As she sat, her eyes wandered across the base of the oak. She noticed something she hadn't before. Faint carvings on the roots, worn by time, but still visible. She brushed the moss aside with her fingertips and gasped softly. Letters, faded, almost erased, but still there. Thomas L. Her breath trembled. It was real. Everything she had found, everything she had read, all of it was true. Tears filled her eyes as she traced the letters. Whoever had carved them must have done it by hand, probably with a dull knife decades ago. It wasn't the work of a craftsman. It was the desperate mark of a grieving parent, trying to make sure their child was remembered somehow. Margaret sat there for a long time, the damp earth soaking through the knees of her jeans. She thought about those parents, Samuel and Ann Larkin, and imagined them kneeling in the same spot, holding each other, their hands shaking as they buried their son beneath this ancient tree. No priest, no cemetery, no ceremony. Just love, sorrow, and a promise. A promise that time had nearly erased. She looked up through the twisting branches above her, where raindrops clung to the leaves like tiny tears. "I won't let anyone forget you," she whispered. "Not while I'm here." As if in answer, a sudden gust of wind rustled through the canopy. The branches swayed, the leaves whispering softly. Rusty barked once, startled, and pressed closer to her. "It's all right," she said with a faint smile. "It's just him saying thank you." When she finally stood, she took one last look at the tiny door. The new lock gleamed against the rough bark. She reached out, placed her hand gently on it, and closed her eyes. For a moment, she imagined she could feel warmth from within, faint but real, like a heartbeat. On her way back, she stopped near the creek. The water was shallow now, moving lazily over stones, but she could picture it how it must have been that day in 1954. Deeper, faster, dangerous. The thought made her chest ache. She crouched by the edge, tossing a small pebble into the current. "Rest easy, little one," she murmured. When she got home, the world seemed quieter. The storm clouds were breaking apart, and streaks of sunlight reached through them, painting the town in gold. Margaret stood on her porch for a while, letting the warmth touch her face. For the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't felt since her husband passed. Peace. But later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first shadows stretched across her living room, Rusty began to bark. Not the excited bark he gave when someone knocked, but the low, uncertain growl of a dog sensing something invisible. Margaret frowned, setting down her teacup. "What is it, boy?" He stood by the window, ears raised, eyes fixed on the forest beyond the backyard. The light outside was dim, the last orange glow fading between the trees. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a flicker, a shape, but when she blinked it was gone. She shook her head, smiling softly to herself. "You're just jumpy, that's all," she said. "We both are." Still, she drew the curtains closed before turning off the light, and as she lay in bed that night, listening to the distant rustle of the trees, she thought she heard something faint. A sound carried on the wind, soft and childlike. A laugh. It wasn't frightening. It was gentle, almost playful. Margaret smiled in the dark. "Good night, Thomas," she whispered. Then the house fell silent again, and somewhere deep in the forest, the ancient oak stood watch, its secret safe once more. The days that followed passed in quiet rhythm. Margaret tended her garden, fed Rusty, and tried to resume the life she'd always known, but the forest would not leave her thoughts. Every time she looked out her window, she imagined the towering oak standing silent and watchful beyond the tree line, guarding its secret beneath the roots. By the fourth evening, she could no longer rest. Something inside her kept insisting that she hadn't yet learned everything. The child's name, Thomas Larkin, haunted her. The carving, the toys, the memorial, it all felt incomplete, as though there was still a story left untold. So she decided to return, not to disturb the grave again, but to understand. The next morning dawned cold and pale. Mist rolled low across the ground, curling around the trunks like ghostly ribbons. Margaret packed her small notebook, a thermos of coffee, and a folder containing the old newspaper clippings she had printed from the archives. She also carried her late husband's pocket knife, not out of fear, but out of memory. Rusty, sensing her restlessness, trotted beside her as she walked toward the woods. The trail felt different this time. The air was heavy, damp, and still. Even the usual chirping of birds seemed absent. When she reached the old oak, she stopped a few feet away and simply stared. The flowers she had laid there were still fresh, though wilted at the edges. The candles had burned down completely, leaving only hardened wax in the dirt. The lock she had placed gleamed faintly in the morning light, untouched. She knelt beside the roots again and opened her notebook. Her fingers were stiff from the cold as she turned to a blank page. Thomas Larkin, she wrote carefully, then below it, drowned in 1954, body buried beneath oak. She paused, then added, parents, Samuel and Anne Larkin, no official grave. She exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of each word. Who were you, little one? She whispered. What happened to your family? The forest, of course, gave no answer. Margaret decided to search for more. She stood, brushing the dirt from her knees, and walked a few yards toward the creek. The path sloped downward until the soft trickle of water reached her ears. The creek was narrow now, barely 2 feet deep, but she imagined it had once been wild and dangerous after heavy rain. She crouched by the bank, touching the water with her fingertips. It was icy cold, even in daylight. A shiver ran through her as she looked upstream, toward the direction of town. She could almost see it. A little boy in the 1950s, barefoot and laughing, chasing a stick floating downstream. She imagined the moment when laughter turned to panic, when the current took him, when the woods swallowed the sound of his cries. She covered her mouth, her throat tight. When she returned to the oak, she noticed something she hadn't before, a faint wooden cross half buried under leaves a few feet from the trunk. She brushed the dirt away and lifted it carefully. It was old, the wood soft and splintering. Faint letters were carved into the surface. TL. Her chest ached. Someone had been here before her. Perhaps the parents, perhaps a friend. They had left this behind long ago, and time had nearly consumed it. As she stood there holding the fragile cross, she realized something deeper. This place was more than a secret memorial. It was an act of love, one that had survived decades of silence and decay. But love deserved memory, not just secrecy. That thought struck her like lightning. She couldn't let this story fade again, not after all she'd seen, not after all she'd disturbed. She returned home with a heavy heart but a clear mind. Sitting at her old oak desk, she opened her laptop again. She searched through local archives, this time digging deeper. Court records, church ledgers, even school enrollment lists. Hours passed. The light outside dimmed. Rusty slept at her feet. Then she found it. A brief entry in a forgotten church record from 1955. Anne Larkin relocated to Chicago after the passing of her husband, Samuel. The family's only child, Thomas, deceased the previous year, requested prayers for the boy's resting place in Willow Creek. Margaret read the words twice, then leaned back in her chair, eyes glistening. So they had left. They'd carried their grief north, leaving the forest behind. But they had never forgotten him. She closed the laptop and whispered into the stillness, "Your mother prayed for you, Thomas. She didn't abandon you." That night, she dreamed. In the dream, she stood once again before the oak tree. Moonlight spilled through the branches like silver threads. The little door was open, but this time there was no darkness behind it, only a soft, golden glow. A child's laughter echoed faintly, and she felt no fear. Only peace. When she awoke, the room was quiet, and the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. She went to the window and looked toward the woods. A single ray of sun pierced through the mist, landing directly in the direction of the old oak. Margaret smiled faintly. She knew what she needed to do next. She would make sure Thomas Larkin was remembered, not as a tragedy hidden in a tree, but as a child who had been loved. She would tell his story. She would bring his name back into the world. And maybe, in doing so, she would bring peace not only to the boy and his parents, but to herself. The sky over Willow Creek was heavy and low, the color of old metal. The air held that quiet stillness that comes before rain, when even the birds pause. Margaret stood on her porch with Rusty at her feet and a folded piece of paper in her hand. Her name and phone number were written on it, along with one more line in careful block letters. In memory of Thomas Larkin, 1949-1954. She didn't usually make signs. She wasn't the type to get involved in community initiatives, as her son liked to call them. She had lived long enough to see most of those efforts turn into gossip and then disappear. But this was different. This wasn't about town. This wasn't about attention. This was about keeping a promise. She tucked the paper into her jacket, locked her door, and made her way toward the woods one last time. Her knee hurt more than usual that morning. She felt every step. The dampness in the air settled into her joints. She told herself it was just age, but she knew it wasn't only that. She was carrying weight. Not physical, not exactly. Something else. The trail into the forest felt familiar now in a way it hadn't in years. Not just as a place she walked, but as a place she belonged to. The branches overhead leaned together, forming a tunnel of leaves, and the air smelled of moss, wet bark, and slow decay. Rusty padded beside her without pulling, calm for once, as if he understood they weren't here to search anymore. They were here to finish something. When she reached the oak, she stopped and let out a long, steady breath. The tree stood as it always had, towering, patient, alive. The tiny metal door was still there, set into the bark like a wound that time had tried to heal around. The new lock she'd placed on it caught the pale light. The lilies she'd brought earlier lay at the base of the trunk, no longer fresh, but not yet gone. The melted wax from the candles had hardened pale against the dark earth. "Good morning, sweetheart," she whispered. "I'm back." She knelt, slow and deliberate. Her knee popped loudly and she winced, but she didn't complain. She pressed her palm to the base of the tree, fingers splayed against the rough bark. It was steady, strong, older than all of them, older than loss. For a moment, she said nothing. She just breathed with it. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I found your name." Her voice shook there. She let it. "And I found your mother," she went on softly. "Not in person, but in the records. She didn't forget you. She didn't leave you behind. She asked people to pray for you. She asked them to remember you." The forest around her seemed to press in, listening. "I thought you should know that." Her eyes filled, but she didn't wipe them yet. Not yet. She set the folded paper down in front of the tree and smoothed the dirt around it with her hand. Then, from her jacket pocket, she took something wrapped in a soft cloth. It wasn't much, just a small wooden cross. Not the fragile, half-rotted one she'd found in the leaves, that one she had brought home and placed carefully on her mantel, safe from weather and time. No. This new one was made from the wood of her husband's old workbench in the garage. She had sanded it herself. Her hands weren't what they used to be, but some things the body remembers forever. On the cross, in the thin, careful cuts, she had carved TL. She laid it gently at the base of the oak, just under the tiny door. "There," she whispered. "Now you're marked again." The words left her on a breath. Her tears came then, quiet and unforced, not the way she cried when her husband died. That had been loud, broken, desperate. This was different. This felt like releasing something she'd been holding too tight. A slow loosening in the chest. "I'm sorry I opened it," she said softly. "I'm sorry I broke the lock. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know it was you, but I do now. And I swear to you, nobody's going to disturb you again. Not while I'm still breathing." She leaned forward and kissed her fingertips, then pressed them gently to the bark beside the door. The bark felt warm. She stayed like that for a long time, listening. The forest was nearly silent. No wind, no birds, no distant engine noise from the highway. Only the faint sound of water from the creek somewhere behind her, trickling through stones. Then, so soft she almost thought she imagined it, there was a sound, not from the creek, from the tree. A little laugh, high, light, happy. She froze, her eyes widened and her breath caught in her throat. Rusty's ears perked and then relaxed. He didn't growl this time. He didn't tremble. He just wagged his tail slow and steady and leaned against her leg. Margaret let out the breath she'd been holding and closed her eyes. "I hear you," she whispered. "I hear you, baby." Her tears spilled over and she let them fall. After a while, she shifted on the damp ground and pulled the folded paper back into her hands. She opened it and pinned it gently into the dirt with 2 smooth stones. It wasn't a fancy plaque. It wasn't bronze or marble or official, but it was a beginning. It said what needed to be said, in plain words, "In memory of Thomas Larkin, 1949, 1954, loved and never forgotten." Below that, in smaller print, she'd written her own name, Margaret Reed, and a phone number. That part wasn't for Thomas. That part was for the world. If anyone came here and saw this, they'd know this was not trash. This was not a hangout spot. This was not somewhere to carve initials, drink beer, or prove how brave you were at night. This was a grave. And if anyone tried to touch that little door again, if anyone thought of checking what's inside, they would call her first. She would make sure of it. She wasn't done yet, though. She had one more thing to say. Her voice, when she spoke again, was steady. "Thomas," she murmured, "I want you to listen to me. I don't know if anyone ever said this to you after it happened. Maybe they did. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe it hurt too much. But I'm going to say it now, and I want you to hear it." She wiped her face with the cuff of her sleeve. "What happened to you was not your fault." Her throat tightened. The words nearly broke her. "It wasn't your fault," she whispered again. "You were just little. You were playing. You weren't bad. You weren't careless. You weren't trouble. You were a child. You hear me?" Her breath wavered. "You were loved." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt full. When she finally pushed herself up from the ground, her knees protested and her back ached, but her chest felt lighter than it had in years. Not since before hospitals and chemo and long nights in waiting rooms. Not since before widowhood, loneliness, and everyone talking to her in voices like she was made of glass. She felt like she had stepped out from under something. She picked up the old melted candles from the dirt and pocketed the scraps of wax. She wasn't going to leave trash here. This was not a place for trash. Then she took one last long look at the oak. The door sat closed, the lock she'd placed glinting. The wooden cross rested at the roots. The flowers lay curled and soft, her little handwritten sign pressed gently into the ground like a promise. "Now you can rest," she whispered. A low wind moved through the leaves overhead. It wasn't strong, just enough to stir them. Light broke through the canopy in thin, shifting bands, landing across her face and hands. She closed her eyes and let it warm her skin. For the first time, the forest didn't feel heavy. It felt like it was breathing with her. When she turned to walk back toward the trail, Rusty trotted at her heel, calm, alert, satisfied. She moved slower than she used to. That was fine. She wasn't trying to outrun anything anymore. Not grief, not time, not silence. As she walked, she thought of the Larkins. She pictured a woman in a thin dress and a man with oil-stained hands, kneeling in the dirt with shaking shoulders. She pictured them placing their boy beneath this tree and making a promise to keep his memory alive, even if the world didn't want to see him. Well, she thought, tightening her jaw, the world would see him now. because his name lived again. His story had been lifted out of the dark quietly, gently, and placed in the light, not as horror, not as rumor, as love. By the time Margaret reached the edge of the trees, the first drops of rain finally began to fall, soft and steady, tapping against the leaves, tapping against her jacket, tapping against the forest floor like 1,000 tiny heartbeats. She didn't hurry. At the end of the trail, she stopped and looked back one final time. "Goodbye for now," she whispered. For a moment, just one, she thought she saw something between the trees, the flicker of a small shape standing beside the oak, like a child watching her with gentle curiosity, like a little boy who wasn't afraid anymore. He was only a pale outline in the shifting light. Then he was gone. Margaret smiled. "Rest easy, Thomas," she said softly. "You're safe." She turned, and with slow, certain steps, she and Rusty walked home through the rain. What Margaret found inside that ancient oak changed her life forever, and restored peace to a forgotten child. If this story touched your heart, don't leave just yet. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us share more true, emotional stories like this one.